My name is Audrey Coleman, and I am 28 years old, but as I stood in the corner of that cold boardroom, I felt like a ghost watching my own life being stolen. My older sister Valerie stood at the podium with a confident smirk while presenting the complex architectural plans she claimed to have designed, even though she could barely draw a straight line. My parents sat in the front row, beaming with pride at their golden child, completely ignoring me, even though I was the one who had spent sleepless nights drawing every single beam. The presentation seemed perfect, until our most important client suddenly stood up and slammed the heavy project file onto the glass table with a deafening crash that made everyone jump. The room fell into a terrified silence as the client stared directly at Valerie with cold fury instead of admiration. He demanded to know why the critical safety load numbers were maliciously altered at exactly 1 hour and 13 minutes past midnight from an IP address that matched her home internet connection perfectly. Valerie turned pale as she realized her plan to frame me for negligence had just exposed her own criminal attempt to destroy the company. My parents looked around in panic, realizing their scheme to ruin my career had backfired in the most public way possible. This is the story of how I let them dig their own graves before I finally pushed them in. Before I tell you how I turn this nightmare into their ultimate punishment, please let me know in the comments what time it is and which city you are watching from, so I can see how far my journey of justice has traveled around the world. To understand the sheer insanity of that moment in the boardroom, I must take you back 3 weeks to the day my grandfather, Silas Coleman, passed away, because that singular event shattered the fragile peace in our household. For the past 5 years, I had been the first person to unlock the office doors at Coleman Architects and the last one to turn off the lights every single night, while Valerie treated the company like her personal social club. She would breeze into the office at noon wearing designer clothes that cost more than my monthly salary, and spend hours disrupting the real architects with her loud phone calls. I spent half my work week fixing the disastrous mistakes she made in her few attempts at actual work just to keep us from being sued by clients. My grandfather saw everything that happened within those walls, even when his health began to fail him in his final months, because he knew exactly who was building the legacy of his company. When he died suddenly from a massive stroke, the entire foundation of our family seemed to crack, right along with my heart, because I had lost my only ally. The funeral was a lavish affair that felt more like a networking event for my parents than a genuine farewell to a beloved patriarch, while my father Douglas spent the entire service shaking hands with business partners. We gathered in the mahogany office of the family attorney a week later to hear the final wishes of the man who started it all, and Valerie sat in the center chair with her chin held high. She fully expected to inherit the empire simply by virtue of being the firstborn child, and had already started talking about remodeling the executive suite. I sat quietly in the corner, clutching my purse and hoping that grandfather had at least left me enough to start my own small practice somewhere far away from them. The attorney cleared his throat nervously before looking over his spectacles to read the clause that would tear our family apart. He announced firmly, "I hereby bequeath 60% of the company shares and the position of lead executive architect to my granddaughter Audrey Coleman, effective immediately." The room went so silent that I could hear the distinct ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway before the atmosphere shattered completely. Valerie did not just cry or argue, she exploded with a rage that made the attorney flinch behind his massive desk while she swept a crystal vase off the side table. She screamed at the top of her lungs, "This is absolute garbage because that rat manipulated a dying old man to steal what rightfully belongs to me." She accused me of poisoning his mind against her during those long evenings I spent reading to him while she was out partying. I looked toward my parents, expecting some voice of reason, or perhaps a defense of their youngest daughter against such wild accusations, but received only cold calculation. They did not see a daughter who had just been honored by her grandfather, but rather a thief who had disrupted their carefully laid plans for Valerie. My father finally spoke up to say that there must be a mistake, and demanded the lawyer review the files for any sign of mental incompetence in grandfather. The lawyer firmly stated that Silas Coleman was of sound mind, and the will was ironclad, which only made the atmosphere in the room more toxic. Valerie stormed out of the office screaming that she would not let me take her company, and my parents followed her immediately without sparing me a single glance. I was left alone in the silent office with the lawyer, who looked at me with pity and handed me the keys to the kingdom that would soon become my battlefield. I realized then that winning the inheritance was not a victory, but a declaration of war against the people I shared blood with. 2 days after the reading of the will, the atmosphere in my childhood home felt suspiciously heavy when my parents invited me over for what they called a reconciliation dinner. I walked into the formal dining room to find the table set with my favorite roast chicken and the vintage red wine that my father usually saved for his most important clients. The warm scent of rosemary and garlic filled the air in a way that was meant to evoke comforting memories of a happy family that we never actually were. However, the thick stack of legal documents placed conspicuously next to the centerpiece told me that this gathering was an ambush rather than a peace offering. My mother Sheila was bustling around the kitchen with a nervous energy that usually signaled she was plotting something, while Valerie sat at the head of the table looking at her phone. She did not even glance up when I entered the room, because she was too busy typing furiously and sipping her wine with an air of bored entitlement. I took my seat at the far end of the table and stared at the intellectual property transfer agreement that was resting just inches away from my plate. My parents sat down with forced smiles that did not reach their eyes and began passing dishes around as if we had not just declared war on each other 48 hours ago. We ate in a suffocating silence that was only broken by the scraping of silverware against china until my mother finally decided to drop the facade of maternal affection. She placed her hand over mine with a cold clamminess that made me want to pull away, and looked at me with an expression of pleading that I knew was entirely manufactured. She started speaking in a soft voice, saying, "Audrey, honey, you know that the Sterling family values prestige above all else, and Valerie needs the title of lead architect to secure her engagement." She explained that they had already told the Sterling family that Valerie was the genius behind the upcoming Skyline project, and revealing the truth now would be a humiliation for everyone. Her logic was that I was still young and had plenty of time to build a career, while Valerie needed this specific achievement right now to solidify her social standing. My mother proposed that I could stay on as the deputy architect to do the actual technical work, while Valerie would take the public credit and handle the client meetings. It was a proposal so insulting that I almost laughed out loud, because they were essentially asking me to be the ghostwriter for my own legacy. Valerie finally looked up from her phone and swirled the wine in her glass, before adding her own twisted perspective to the conversation. She did not beg or ask nicely, but instead looked at me with the same disdain she had used since we were children playing in the backyard. She leaned forward with a sneer and said, "Stop acting like this is a big deal, because you know perfectly well that you have the personality of a brick wall, while I was born to lead this company." She claimed that clients wanted to see someone beautiful and charismatic representing their investments, rather than a boring technician who cared more about load-bearing walls than cocktail parties. She insisted that she was doing me a favor by taking the spotlight, because I was clearly not equipped to handle the pressure of public scrutiny. I felt a cold fury rising in my chest as I listened to them dismiss my years of hard work as nothing more than a support service for Valerie's vanity project. I pushed my plate away and looked directly at my sister, who had never drawn a viable blueprint in her entire life. I kept my voice steady as I replied, "I seem to recall that your charismatic leadership on the Lakeside project cost the firm $300,000 in legal fees until I stepped in to fix the structural issues you ignored." I reminded them that grandfather left the company to me precisely because he knew Valerie would bankrupt it within a year with her incompetence and spending habits. I placed my hand on the stack of documents and shoved them across the polished table toward my father, who had been watching the exchange with narrowing eyes. I told them clearly that I would not sign away my rights, and I would not let Valerie put her name on drawings she could not even read. I stood up to leave, because the sight of them sitting there and plotting to strip me of my inheritance made me physically ill. My father Douglas immediately stood up and moved quickly to block the arched doorway with his imposing frame to prevent me from leaving. His face was no longer that of a parent, but of a ruthless businessman who was losing control of his assets. He towered over me and lowered his voice to a menacing growl that vibrated through the small space between us. He pointed a finger in my face and said, "If you walk out that door without signing these papers, Audrey, I will make sure you never work in this industry again, because I still have friends who can blacklist you." He threatened to cut me off from the family entirely and ensure that I would face legal battles that would drain every penny of the inheritance I had just received. I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me and realized that my family had died along with my grandfather. I stepped around him without saying another word and walked out into the cold night, knowing that the real war had just begun. Into the early morning of the following Monday, my father's warning turned into a deadly trap that was designed to end my career permanently. I arrived at the Coleman Architects' headquarters at the crack of dawn, because a nagging sense of unease had kept me awake for most of the night, tossing and turning. The office was completely deserted and bathed in the eerie blue glow of the emergency lights as I made my way to my workstation to review the final submission files for the Skyline project one last time. I logged into the secure server and prepared to bundle the architectural drawings for the printing department when something on the screen made my heart stop cold in my chest. The digital timestamp in the last modified column showed that the structural folder had been accessed and saved at exactly 1 hour and 13 minutes past midnight, while I was sound asleep in my apartment across town. My hands trembled as I clicked on the file history because I knew for a fact that I was the only person with administrative privileges to alter those specific engineering documents. I opened the foundation schematics and scrolled frantically through the complex layers of data until I found the red flags that indicated recent changes. The load-bearing capacity for the main steel support columns had been reduced by exactly 40%, which was a modification so subtle that a casual observer might miss it, but so catastrophic that it would guarantee a structural failure. If the building were constructed according to these sabotaged plans, the entire steel skeleton would buckle under its own weight before the glass facade was even installed. This was not a simple clerical error or a glitch in the software, but a calculated attempt to turn my design into a mass grave. I immediately called Marcus, who was our head of information technology, and dragged him out of bed, with a panic in my voice that told him this was a dire emergency. He arrived 20 minutes later looking disheveled but alert, and we huddled together in the glow of his multiple monitors to trace the digital footprints of the intruder. I watched his fingers fly across the keyboard as he pulled up the security logs and the server access history to find out who had tried to destroy the project. Marcus frowned deeply as he pointed to the screen where my own name was flashing as the user responsible for the deadly changes. He turned to me with a serious expression and said, "The system shows that your personal admin account was used to log in remotely at 1:13 a.m., which means whoever did this had your password and security token." I felt the blood drain from my face because I realized that the only other people who had access to my emergency backup codes were my parents. I begged Marcus to dig deeper because I needed to prove that I was not the one sitting behind a computer screen in the middle of the night, sabotaging my own life's work. Marcus initiated a deep packet inspection to trace the origin of the connection and bypass the virtual private network that the intruder had used to mask their location. He worked in tense silence for several minutes, while I paced back and forth behind his chair, praying that technology would provide the alibi that I desperately needed. Suddenly, Marcus stopped typing and leaned closer to the screen with a look of disbelief washing over his face as the tracking software pierced through the digital disguise. He swiveled his chair around to face me and said, "The intruder used a high-end VPN to hide their IP address, but they made a rookie mistake by leaving the GPS location services enabled on the device they used to connect." He highlighted a set of coordinates on the map that was displayed on the secondary monitor, and I felt my stomach drop as I recognized the location immediately. The pulsing red dot was pinpointed exactly at 45 Oak Avenue, which was the address of the sprawling estate where my parents and Valerie lived. Marcus looked at me with sympathy and whispered, "Audrey, the connection came from the primary residential network at your parents' house, which means one of them used your credentials to frame you." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow because this went far beyond simple jealousy or a desire to steal credit for a prestigious project. My father and Valerie were not just trying to push me out of the company, but were actively engineering a scenario where I would be held criminally liable for a catastrophic building collapse. They wanted me to submit these flawed plans so that when the engineering review board discovered the negligence, I would be stripped of my license and potentially sent to prison for endangering public safety. It was a cold and calculated murder attempt on my character that would legally disqualify me from inheriting the company under the morality clause of the corporate bylaws. I stared at the blinking cursor on the screen and realized that the people who raised me were willing to sacrifice the lives of future building occupants just to keep their power. My father had not been making an idle threat when he blocked the doorway 2 nights ago, but was actually giving me a preview of the destruction he had already set in motion. I knew in that moment that I could no longer treat them as family members who were simply misguided, but had to view them as dangerous criminals who needed to be stopped. I looked at Marcus and told him to save every single byte of data to an external drive because we were going to need undeniable proof to survive what was coming next. 3 hours after I discovered the corrupted file, their next attack landed with the precision of a military strike designed to cripple my defenses before I could even mount a counterattack. I was still sitting at my desk attempting to document the digital evidence with Marcus when a high-priority notification flashed across my monitor from the office of the honorary chairman. My father Douglas had utilized his remaining executive privileges to issue an immediate suspension order against me, citing gross negligence and suspected internal sabotage as the primary reasons. The memorandum was copied to every single employee in the company and stated that I was to be escorted off the premises immediately pending a formal internal investigation into my conduct. It was a masterclass in gaslighting because he was accusing me of the exact crime that he and Valerie had committed just a few hours prior in the dead of night. I watched as my access to the company servers was revoked in real time, and my email account turned gray as the IT department was forced to lock me out of the system I helped build. Security guards appeared at the entrance of the open plan office within minutes and marched toward my desk while my colleagues watched in stunned silence. One of the guards grabbed my arm roughly and barked loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Ma'am, you need to step away from the computer right now, or we will be forced to physically remove you from the building for violating company policy." I packed my personal belongings into a cardboard box with trembling hands while feeling the weight of 100 pairs of eyes burning into my back. The humiliation did not stop at the office doors, because my mother Sheila had already begun her part of their coordinated strategy to destroy my reputation within our social circles. My phone began buzzing incessantly with messages from friends and business associates who had heard disturbing rumors that I had suffered a severe mental breakdown due to professional jealousy. She was calling the board members and key clients to tearfully explain that I had become delusional and paranoid since the reading of the will and had tried to sabotage the project to get attention. She painted a picture of an unstable daughter who needed professional psychiatric help rather than a capable architect who had been framed by her own family for a crime she did not commit. I realized as I walked to the elevator that they were not just trying to fire me, but were systematically dismantling my credibility so that no one would believe me when I eventually revealed the truth. I stepped out of the elevator into the marble lobby feeling completely isolated and stripped of the identity I had worked so hard to establish over the last 5 years. I was walking toward the revolving doors with my head down when a familiar figure stepped out from the shadow of a large decorative pillar to block my path. It was Mrs. Edith, who had served as my grandfather's loyal executive secretary for over 40 years and knew the secrets of the Coleman family better than anyone else alive. She looked older and more fragile than I remembered, but her eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had made her the gatekeeper to the founder's office for decades. She placed a gentle hand on my arm to stop me and looked at the box of personal items in my arms with a knowing expression that told me she understood exactly what was happening. I tried to pull away because I did not want her to see me in such a disgraceful state, but she tightened her grip and leaned in closer to whisper so the security guards would not hear. She looked me dead in the eye and hissed, "Stop acting like a victim, Audrey, because if you walk out that door with your head hanging down, then Douglas has already won this war." I argued that I had no power left to fight them because they had taken my job and my reputation and turned the entire board against me. Mrs. Edith shook her head slowly and revealed that the abnormal favoritism my parents showed Valerie was not born out of love or pride as I had always assumed. She explained that Douglas and Sheila were terrified of Valerie and the secret she represented, which was a darkness that my grandfather had kept contained while he was alive. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a heavy brass key that looked like it belonged to a different era before pressing it firmly into the palm of my hand. She told me that this key opened safe deposit box number 804 at the central bank, and that my grandfather had instructed her to give it to me only if the family tried to destroy me. She warned me with a trembling voice, saying, "What you find inside will hurt you deeply, but it is the only weapon powerful enough to cut the strings they are using to strangle you." She said that my grandfather knew this day might come, and he had prepared a failsafe to ensure that I would not be the one to pay for the sins of my father. I looked at the cold metal in my hand and felt a surge of hope mixed with dread, because I knew that whatever was in that box would change everything forever. Mrs. Edith squeezed my hand one last time and told me to go immediately before my father saw us talking and suspected that his past was coming back to haunt him. I walked out of the building clutching the key like a lifeline and hailed a taxi, knowing that I was no longer fleeing a defeat but heading toward the truth. For the next 48 hours, I plunged into a race against time to save my honor, because sitting around and waiting for my parents to destroy me was no longer an option. I transformed my small apartment into a command center for the counterattack and brought in the heavy artillery in the form of a private investigator named Harding. Harding was a former economic crimes investigator for the federal government who had transitioned into the private sector to handle cases exactly like mine, where money and blood mixed in toxic ways. He arrived at my door with a weathered leather briefcase and the kind of cynical expression that suggested he had seen every possible variation of family betrayal. I introduced him to Marcus, who had managed to sneak a secure laptop out of the office before his own access was restricted by the new administration. The three of us sat around my dining table, which was covered in server logs and network diagrams, as we plotted how to retrieve the one piece of evidence that could exonerate me. My father was a brilliant businessman, but he was technologically illiterate enough to believe that deleting a file from a local hard drive meant it was gone forever. He did not understand that the security system I had installed 2 years ago automatically backed up all surveillance footage to an encrypted off-site cloud server every 15 minutes. Marcus explained that breaking into that cloud server without an active admin password would be difficult, but not impossible, if we combined his coding skills with Harding's digital forensic software. The hours ticked by with agonizing slowness, while Marcus typed furiously, and Harding monitored the progress bars that crawled across the multiple screens we had set up. I paced the length of my living room until I wore a path in the rug because the suspense was physically painful to endure. Finally, a soft chime from the main monitor announced that the encryption had been bypassed, and the archived footage from the night of the sabotage was ready for viewing. Marcus clicked on the file stamped 1 o'clock in the morning, and we all leaned in closer to witness the crime that had turned my life upside down. The black and white footage was crystal clear and showed the hallway leading to the secure server room at the Coleman Architects headquarters. At exactly 1 hour and 10 minutes past midnight, the elevator doors opened to reveal my father Douglas and my sister Valerie stepping out into the deserted corridor. They were not sneaking around with the guilt of criminals, but walking confidently like they owned the place, which technically my father still believed he did. I watched in horror as my father used his master key to unlock the server room door and ushered Valerie inside like a proud parent dropping a child off at school. The interior camera angle switched to show Valerie sitting at the terminal, while my father stood over her shoulder pointing at specific lines of code on the screen. Marcus turned up the volume on his laptop speakers, and the sound of their voices filled my quiet apartment like a toxic fog that made it hard to breathe. Valerie giggled as she hovered over the enter key and asked my father, "Are you sure this will actually work, Dad? Because Audrey might be boring, but she is meticulous about checking her numbers." My father leaned closer to the microphone and his voice was clear and chilling as he replied, "She won't notice until it is too late because she trusts the system more than she trusts her own instincts." He pointed at the screen and added with a sneer, "Just change the load-bearing ratio to 60%, and by the time the Safety Commission flags it, she will be stripped of her license and we will be free of her." Valerie clapped her hands in delight and said, "I cannot wait to see the look on her face when the police escort her out of the building forever." Harding froze the frame on a shot of their smiling faces and turned to me with a grim expression that left no room for interpretation. He tapped the screen with his pen and said, "This is not just a civil dispute about a will anymore, Audrey, because what we are looking at is clear evidence of corporate sabotage and conspiracy to endanger public safety." He explained that the federal sentencing guidelines for tampering with engineering documents of a high-rise structure were severe and would almost certainly result in significant prison time for both of them. He looked me dead in the eye and asked, "Are you prepared to be the reason your father and sister go to federal prison? Because once we hand this over to the authorities, there is no taking it back." I stared at the frozen image of my father's face on the screen and felt a physical ache in my chest that made it hard to breathe. I realized that the father I was mourning had ceased to exist a long time ago and had been replaced by a monster who would sacrifice his own child for power. I wiped a tear from my cheek and looked up at Harding with a resolve that surprised even me. I kept my voice steady as I replied, "My father made his choice when he decided to frame me for a crime I didn't commit. So now he has to live with the consequences of his actions." I told them to organize the files and prepare the final report because I was done protecting people who would happily watch me rot in a jail cell. Into the night before the important presentation, I stood alone in the cold security vault of the central bank, with the heavy brass key pressing into my palm. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low vibration that matched the nervous energy coursing through my veins as I located box number 804 in the wall of stainless steel drawers. I inserted the key that Mrs. Edith had given me and turned it slowly until I heard the satisfying click of the tumblers falling into place, which signaled the release of 30 years of family secrets. I pulled the long metal drawer out and carried it to the private viewing table in the corner of the room, where I sat down and took a deep breath before lifting the lid. Inside the box there were no jewels or stacks of cash, but only a thick manila envelope that smelled of old paper and a single leather-bound journal that belonged to my grandfather Silas. I opened the envelope first and pulled out a stack of yellowed documents including a birth certificate that looked undeniably official, yet completely wrong, because it listed my father Douglas as the parent, but the mother was a woman named Elena, who was definitely not my mother Sheila. I stared at the paper in disbelief as I realized that Valerie was not my full sister, but was actually the product of a long-term affair my father had carried on during the early years of his marriage. I picked up my grandfather's journal and began to read the entry dated shortly after Valerie was born, where he detailed the horrific bargain that had defined our family dynamic for 3 decades. My mother Sheila had agreed to adopt the illegitimate child and raise her as her own to save the family from a public scandal that would have destroyed their social standing. However, she had exacted a terrible psychological price for her silence because she demanded that Douglas give her complete control over how the children were raised. The journal explained that Sheila secretly despised Valerie as the living proof of her husband's infidelity, but she treated her like a princess in public to prove to the world that she was a saintly and perfect mother. The twist that made my stomach turn was reading that Sheila vented all her suppressed rage and resentment onto me because I was the only safe target for her anger. I was the legitimate child born of their marriage, but to her, I was simply the constant reminder of the loveless obligation she was trapped in, while Valerie was the project she used to maintain her facade. I finally understood why no amount of straight A grades or architectural awards could ever make them love me, because in their twisted narrative, I was the burden, and Valerie was the prize they had to polish. I turned to the final page of the documents and found a legal codicil to my grandfather's will that was signed and notarized just months before his death. Silas Coleman had anticipated that his son and daughter-in-law might try to rewrite history after he was gone, so he had installed a fail-safe mechanism that acted like a legal landmine. The clause stated clearly that if the truth about Valerie's parentage was ever concealed to defraud the legitimate heir, or if Valerie ever attempted to harm the legitimate heir in any way, she would be immediately disinherited. The document specified that any attempt to sabotage my career or reputation would be considered a violation of the morality clause and would result in the total forfeiture of any trust funds or assets previously allocated to her. My father and sister had walked blindly into this trap when they decided to alter the server files because their act of sabotage was the precise trigger that activated this punishment. They thought they were destroying me, but they were actually signing their own financial death warrants with every keystroke they made that night. I gathered the documents with a newfound sense of power because I was no longer the victim of a cruel family dynamic, but the enforcer of my grandfather's final justice. I left the bank vault and went straight to a 24-hour business center where I made high-resolution digital scans of every single page, including the birth certificate and the journal entries. I compiled these documents into a comprehensive evidence package along with the server logs and the surveillance video that Harding had recovered from the cloud. I sent an encrypted copy of the entire file to the Economic Crimes Unit of the police department, and another copy to the personal email of Mr. Sterling to ensure he saw the truth before the meeting began. I spent the remaining hours of the night preparing a new presentation for the board meeting that would not feature architectural renderings, but would instead display the anatomy of a betrayal. I did not sleep at all that night, but I did not feel tired because the adrenaline of impending justice was fueling every cell in my body. I stood by my window watching the sun rise over the city skyline and felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that when I walked into that boardroom in a few hours, I would finally be free of them forever. Early the next morning, I pushed open the doors to the glass boardroom, where all eyes were fixed on Valerie following Mr. Sterling's devastating question about the IP address. The silence in the room was so profound that it felt as though the air had been sucked out, leaving my sister gasping like a fish out of water, while my parents looked around in frantic desperation. I walked calmly to the head of the table and plugged my laptop into the main projection system, while ignoring the venomous glare my father shot in my direction. I addressed the board members with a steady voice, stating that the answer to Mr. Sterling's question could be found in the security footage from the night the files were corrupted. I pressed the play button, and the large screen behind me came to life, showing the undeniable image of Douglas and Valerie entering the server room with smiles on their faces. The audio from the video boomed through the conference room speakers, allowing everyone to hear my father instructing Valerie on exactly how to compromise the structural integrity of the building to frame me. My father slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "This is an absolute fabrication because that ungrateful girl doctored the footage to steal the company from her sister, you." I looked him dead in the eye and replied calmly, "This footage has been verified by digital forensics and the timestamp matches the exact moment the files were corrupted, so you cannot lie your way out of this one, Dad." The board members gasped in collective horror as they watched their honorary chairman conspire to destroy the company's reputation just to settle a petty family vendetta against his own daughter. I did not stop there because I needed to sever the tie completely, so I pulled up the digitized documents from the safe deposit box to deliver the final blow. I revealed the birth certificate and the letter from my grandfather explaining that Valerie's true parentage had been hidden to protect the family image at the expense of my well-being. Valerie stood up with her face turning purple and shrieked, "You are making this up because grandfather loved me more than he ever loved a disappointment like you." I held up the signed morality clause and said, "Actually, grandfather anticipated your greed, so he wrote this specific clause, stating that if you ever tried to harm me, you would lose every single penny of your inheritance, effective Immediately, she collapsed into her chair as she realized her golden parachute had just been set on fire by the very man she thought she had fooled. The doors to the conference room opened again, and two officers from the Economic Crimes Unit stepped inside to place handcuffs on my father for corporate fraud and endangerment. As the officer tightened the cuffs, my father looked at me with desperation replacing his arrogance, and pleaded, "Audrey, please tell them to stop, because I am your father, and you cannot let them take me away, like a common criminal." I turned my back on him and said, "A real father would not try to send his daughter to prison for a crime he committed, so you lost the right to that title the moment you walked into that server room." Valerie was escorted out by security personnel while sobbing uncontrollably and begging my mother to do something, but Sheila just sat there frozen in the ruins of her social status. 6 months have passed since that explosive morning, and the landscape of my life has changed completely to resemble something peaceful and productive. My father is currently serving a 5-year sentence in a federal penitentiary, where his wealth and connections mean absolutely nothing to the other inmates. Valerie lost her apartment and her luxury car, and I heard from a mutual acquaintance that she is now stocking shelves at a grocery store to make ends meet because no architectural firm will hire her. My mother lives alone in the big house that she can no longer afford to maintain, and she spends her days waiting for phone calls from friends who have all abandoned her. I rebranded the company as Silas Architecture to honor the only man who believed in me, and I established a scholarship fund for underprivileged students who have the talent but lack the resources. I walk into my office every day feeling a lightness in my chest that comes from knowing I am finally free of the toxic shadows of the past. I no longer look over my shoulder waiting for the next knife in my back because the people holding the knives are gone. I have built a new family consisting of friends and colleagues who respect me for my work rather than my bloodline. The most important lesson I learned from this harrowing experience is that you should never set yourself on fire just to keep other people warm, even if those people are your family. Cutting ties with toxic relatives is not an act of betrayal, but a necessary act of survival to protect your own mental health and future. You deserve to be surrounded by people who celebrate your success, rather than those who view your achievements as a threat to their own fragile egos. True family is built on mutual respect and love, rather than shared DNA and obligation, so do not be afraid to walk away from anyone who constantly diminishes your worth. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and for walking this difficult path to justice with me until the very end. I appreciate every single one of you who supports this channel, and I would love to hear your thoughts on how I handled the situation in the comments section below. Please remember to share this story if it resonated with you, and stay tuned for more true stories of resilience.